starting notionally at 6, more or less at 5 past. Alex and Ruth are going to present jointly for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that, and finish at 7:30. So, well, let me just say then a little bit about our speakers, Ruth Kinna and Alex Prichard. Ruth is a professor of political theory in the Department of International Relations, Politics and History at Loughborough University. She is a prolific researcher and writer. I had a look at her publications, and there are too many, basically. So I'll just mention one or two. She's published a book on William Morris, which I'm very interested in, so I quite like that. But of course, she's very well known for her work on the history of anarchist political thought and practice, anarchist practice, I think, as well. So she published Anarchism, A Beginner's Guide in 2005. The Bloomsbury Continuum Companion to Anarchism. I'm not quite sure. Did that change its title? I don't know. A book on Kropotkin in 2016. And recently, her very well received The Government of No One, the Theory and Practice of Anarchism. She's co-editor of the journal Anarchist Studies, series editor for a book series on radical subjects, and The Government of No One was shortlisted for the 2020 Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. And Ruth's works, she's very well known, of course, and her work's been translated into a variety of languages, including French, Georgian, Hungarian, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, Spanish, and Turkish. So I'm very, very pleased that Ruth's agreed to, together with Alex, to speak tonight. Alex Prichard is a professor of international political theory at the University of Exeter. He's a leading authority on anarchist political thought, like Ruth, and history, with a particular interest in international relations, how anarchists theorize war, peace, and the global order. Alex also is a prolific researcher and writer. He's, in addition to numerous journal articles and book chapters, he's published a book on Proudhon, Justice, Order, and Anarchy, the International Political Theory of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, in 2013. And he's the author of the Anarchism, A Very Short Introduction, that well-known book series published by Oxford University Press in 2022. He's co-founder of the PSA, Political Studies Association of Great Britain's Anarchist Studies Network, and again, inaugurated as the series editor for the Manchester University Press monograph series, Contemporary Anarchist Studies. Ruth and Alex tonight are going to give a talk based on a research project they've been involved in, and the title of the talk is Anarchist Constitutional Politics, Oxymoron or Paradigm Shift. So over to you, Ruth and Alex. I hope I didn't get anything wrong. Well, you correct me, but no, good. Right, I'll switch my mic off and you can, off you go.
Thank you so much, Tony. Let me pull up our presentation, share it with you. So, oops, let me get there we go. Ruth, are you there?
Yep, ready to go.
All right. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much to Oliver and to Tony for the invitation. It's really great to give this talk. Not our first rodeo with the centre, and it's really nice to be invited back. Clearly, we didn't burn our bridges the first time round. One of the things that I think is worth pointing out that Tony didn't mention is the centre was instrumental in some of the projects that we were doing very early on about the intersections between anarchism and Marxism. And while we're not going to be talking about that directly today, I think the centre's been really, really supportive of our research all the way through, and I'm really grateful to Tony for that in particular. So we're going to give a book talk today. We're going to summarize the book. We'll set it up for you and explain where it came from. And then what we're going to do is outline the sort of the conceptual setup before we engage in a bit more detail with this relationship between war and federalism. So the point of the book is the book provides an account of anarchist constitutionalizing, and federalism is arguably the core concept in an anarchist constitutional politics. And what we're doing in this presentation is we're going to explain to you why federalism matters for the anarchists and how this is an anarchist, or how this works as an instantiation of anarchy, if you like. And then we'll zoom back out again at the end to talk about the talk's title, which is whether anarchist constitutionalizing is an oxymoron or a paradigm shift. I don't think we're going to answer the paradigm shift question, because I think it's a little bold, perhaps, but it's a nice catchy title. So we'll see where we get. Okay, so let me just give you a very brief introduction to the project as a whole, and then we'll switch over. So Ruth and I started this project in around about 2011 or thereabouts, 2012, and we had a discussion about whether we thought that the revival of neo-republican political thought from the late 90s, but in particular the work of Philip Pettit, whether that was a useful hook for thinking about anarchism. And what we discovered very quickly was that the focus on domination and non-domination that's part of this neo-republican revival was also a central preoccupation for the anarchists during this period. But not only had the anarchist scholars, or scholars of anarchism, not only had they not paid any attention to this, but the Republicans, of course, had completely ignored it. So what we've been doing since about 2011 is to try and explain how an anarchist constitutional politics emerged out of this engagement and debate with the Republicans, particularly in terms of its constitutional politics. So we're essentially talking to a number of different groups, and this causes all sorts of problems, not only for the way that we present the project, but also, of course, in terms of how we make this sensible to people in a range of different disciplines, even though these are obviously very cognizant disciplines. So the first, of course, is political theorists. And in political theory, the tradition is, of course, to juxtapose freedom with anarchy. Anarchy is the opposite of freedom. It's certainly the opposite of constitutional politics, and we'll come to that in a second. But freedom is only possible in the absence of anarchy. We can only have freedom once we've transcended anarchy, moved beyond it. And this is essentially the main setup, which is why much of anarchist political thought gets sidelined in international politics, but also, we think, why we have so much to offer to reconfigure that concept. IR theorists take another approach, quite the opposite. They say that anarchy, at least the realist tradition, and many of the liberals and constructivists too, argue that anarchy is the central problematic of international politics, and to give a realistic account of the nature of the international, we have to take account of anarchy as its central organizing principle, or its structural characteristic. But ironically, of course, IR theorists and political theorists don't speak to each other. This is only ironic because we're going to now collapse it in the rest of this presentation. But the setup between political theory and IR theory really demarcates the nature of political science as an approach to the world, and it's all predicated around a particular account of anarchy, one which rejects it, the other one which accepts it. Now, the new constitutional theorists are anti-capitalists, but central to this account of constitutionalism, the critique of constitutionalism, the way in which constitutional theory can develop in this sort of post-sovereign or in a world in which nation states are being reaffirmed. The point of constitutional theory is really to bind power, and they completely ignore the anarchists. The anarchists simply don't feature in this literature. It's as though that bogeyman has been put to bed a long time ago. And finally, of course, we're speaking to the anarchists, who are traditionally, of course, anti-constitutionalists. So anarchists have not considered their work to be within the sort of broadly constitutional paradigm or constitutional theory. In fact, the notion of a constitution is often considered to be antithetical to anarchism. But we discovered very early in our project that if you look at what the anarchists are doing, they are doing precisely what every other constitutional theorist and practitioner has done throughout history. They are identifying and challenging power dynamics or regimes of domination, as Uri Gordon calls them, and they're doing it through very standard constitutional means. That is by writing declarative statements, developing rules, institutions, decision-making procedures, all of these things that we take for granted in constitutional practice is part and parcel of what the anarchists do too. They just don't call it constitutionalizing. So what we're going to do then in this presentation is we're going to try and unpack that. But what the book does is it has two broad parts. It's one case study in the study of anarchist constitutionalizing, but it has a historical and theoretical narrative, which then unfurls in the second half of the book into an account of how anarchists have organized today. And the theoretical claims that we try to make is that anarchy as a principle, and I'll define that in a second, but headline, anarchy is, as we define it, the absence of a final and fixed point of authority. We argue that anarchy is a viable constitutional principle, and if we value freedom, it is the one that we should be turning towards. Okay, over to you, Ruth.
Right, thanks, Alex. So I'm going to unpack some of the arguments of the first chapter, which is where we try and show how the better known anti-constitutional critique that anarchists raised of liberalism and republicanism in the 19th century also elicits a positive theory of constitutionalizing. So one of the things that we do in the chapter is acknowledge the force of the anti-liberal and anti-republican constitutional critique, and then we show through the sort of the groundwork, if you like, that anarchists, or the theoretical groundwork that anarchists, including Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Gustav Landauer, the work that they did to unpack the elements of mainstream constitutionalism in order to articulate a different approach, a bottom-up approach to constitutionalizing. And we argue in the introduction that this approach, this anarchist approach to constitutionalizing, aligns with some of the work that's been done in global constitutionalism with what's called social constitutional practice. So one of the things we want to do is, I mean, a lot of the work that we do in the chapter focuses on the anarchist critique of contract theory. But what we try and show in the chapter is that critique of contract theory, which of course doesn't exhaust critiques of the state, elicited an alternative sociology of the state and society through which the anarchists articulated a critique of constitutionalism which was balanced with a positive conception of constitutionalizing. Now, there are two main differences between a non-anarchist constitutional approach and an anarchist constitutional approach. The first is what Alex has already alluded to, which is the idea that the Constitution for the anarchist is based on a rejection of law and a rejection of state sovereignty, and a rejection of the idea that we require, or indeed that people who constitutionalize actually invent permanent fixed sources of authority. Having said that, what you'd expect to see in an anarchist constitutional politics, and what you do see in anarchist constitutional practice, are four pillars of constitutional politics. And these are the existence, or the statement of declarative principles. So we'll get on to Occupy a bit later in the talk. But for example, we the people in the Occupy movement, we are the 99%. You'll expect to see systems of rules. These may be more or less formal, but they will regulate, whether they're formal or not, they will regulate institutions. And the final pillar is the elaboration of decision-making processes, which are in contemporary political practice conventionally by consensus rather than by majority vote. The second difference that we see in anarchist constitutionalizing is that the Constitution for anarchists is not a special moment. Rather, it's a continuous practice. So that practice is the process through which individuals and groups constitute themselves or create themselves through their interrelation. So what we don't see in anarchist politics is the exclusive focus on a constituent council or on a sort of a moment of creation. What you see instead is a continuous process of creation and recreation through which individuals and groups define themselves. Okay, over to you.
Oh, not muted anymore. Right. So we've given an account of essentially the underpinnings of this critique of contemporary constitutionalism. We've argued that there's some real synergies between anarchism and mainstream, or if you like, normal constitutionalizing. But what we've tried to say is that those processes are without foundation, they are open, and the reality is that it's usually done without fixed point of authority. So the reality of constitutional politics is that it lacks that finality. And what we do in chapter 2 is we set that out in both ontological terms and cultural terms. So very briefly, and this matters for, incidentally, for the account of war and federation that we're about to give in a second. So essentially what we argue is that individuals are groups and groups are individuals too. And so this is through the process of social power, or through the exercise of what Proudhon called puissance. Individuals coalesce as individuals through the multiple processes that make us, whether those are social or internal biological or conceptual and cognitive. And as we coalesce as individuals, we do so automatically and of necessity through the constellation and creation of groups. So our external groups can be both material, but also ideational or ideological, and they have both individuals, non-human animals, and so on. And this grouping is a fundamental underpinning of the emergence of society. And it's an idea that Proudhon took from people like Auguste Comte, but it was extremely persuasive and was a central element of the emergence of socialism in France in the late 19th century. But within that theory then also is this notion of individual sovereignty. That is that once we are grouped, our conscience, our conscious conscience is what determines our actions. We will things into being. But likewise, we're also constrained and constructed through necessity. So the two things are there, but it's only if we recognize the dignity and sovereignty of the individual that we can ground an ethics. And this is an idea that came from people like Josiah Warren in the early 1840s and taken up again by John Stuart Mill later as part of this sort of the backbone of a liberal ideology. But at its core, this was an anarchist idea first. Where it differs from anarchism, we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about Spencer and Kropotkin. But centrally, this process, of course, is fundamentally cultural. And from Rudolf Rocker, what we argue is that the anarchists determine culture as being an expression of the will to freedom, whereas for the fascists that he's arguing against, it's a will to power. But for the anarchists, this is an attempt to affirm collectives as both the condition of possibility for the individual, but also as normative and real entities in their own right. So the critique that comes from this, of course, is that the state can't represent this radical difference. It can't, cultural difference can't be either conflated with upwardly to the state or downwardly to individuals. There is a radically complex social ontology that the anarchists recognize that is born of this social theory. Essentially what they're arguing is that society is of necessity always already anarchic, just as nature is too, and as a consequence, politics, the state can't contain these tensions, and the attempt to do so is precisely what causes the crises that we experience, or at least the types of crises that we experience in modern late capitalism. So essentially what we're arguing is that anarchy is the condition of politics we're trying to affirm, not a condition that we're trying to overcome, which is the standard refrain either in IR, international relations, or in political theory, and certainly in Republican and constitutional theory. Oops.
Okay, so the third chapter is the chapter on war and federalism, which is what we're going to sort of hover over in a little bit more detail for the talk today. And the starting point is a challenge that we make to the realist contention that anarchists are consistent utopians in that they reject violence and therefore they reject the state. And we want to sort of complicate that notion. So we don't want to reject the idea that anarchists are in some senses utopian, but what we want to say is their utopianism is rooted in realism, in political realism. Likewise, we treat the thesis of mutual aid, and I'll say a bit more about this in a second when we talk about Kropotkin, but insofar as mutual aid is a generic marker, or has become a generic marker of anarchism, we treat mutual aid, or we specify that mutual aid is not an expression of goodness. It's an expression, or it's a manifestation of cooperation, which allows space for conflict, and which, from Kropotkin's point of view, gives us more tools or better tools for conflict resolution. So the idea of mutual aid, again, to come back to this notion of sort of anarchy in the state, mutual aid is not a mirror of the violence of the state. It's a transformation of that violence. The argument of the chapter is that anarchists understand war as a condition of politics, but that they believe that the physical violence is an expression of the relationships that politics fosters in the constitution. So to go back to what Alex was saying about political cultures, what anarchists are doing is trying to distinguish between types of political culture in order to advocate for cultures which enable conflict resolution without smothering the possibility of conflict, and against political cultures which are based on the will to, what Rocker calls the will to power, and which channel us towards hierarchy and homogeneity and authority. So the chapter looks at three anarchists: Tolstoy, Proudhon, and Kropotkin. And one of the things that we want to do in the chapter is to complicate, I guess, the argument that seems to have seems now to dominate contemporary anarchist theory, which tends to set Tolstoy and Proudhon against other and to some extent Kropotkin too, but sets non-violent or pacifist anarchists against anarchists who refuse to reject violence and who advocate for diversity of tactics. And what we're doing is saying that that's not really the main fracture in anarchist thinking. The main fracture for us between Tolstoy on one hand and Proudhon and Kropotkin on the other is the extent to which politics gives us scope to constitutionalize. And broadly speaking, the answer that Tolstoy gives us, which I'll talk about in a second, is that politics cannot be constitutionalized. There is no escape from the violence of politics. And the answer that Proudhon and Kropotkin give us in two rather different ways is that we can constitutionalize and therefore mitigate the harms of the state through different political cultures. Okay, so if we go to Tolstoy. So the thesis that we associate with Tolstoy is in the title here. So Tolstoy understands war as a manifestation of social attachment, which is distorted by hierarchy. And to explain this a little bit, we're looking in particular at Tolstoy's War and Peace, which we treat as a sort of a companion piece or a parallel text to Proudhon's War and Peace, and as a serious political statement, not just a brilliant novel. So Tolstoy's argument, or one of the things that Tolstoy wants to talk about in War and Peace, is to answer the question, why do men fight? And the answer, or in answering that question, he examines critically the idea that the answer to war comes solely or exclusively from the notion of command, that the reason that we fight is because we're following the will of the leader. He wants to reject the great man of history thesis, which suggests that history is driven by the will of these brilliant people, and that the rest of us sort of fall along and just do what they say. Instead, Tolstoy argues that the reasons that men fight, the reasons, as he puts it, that millions of men or tens of thousands of men at least will march from one side of the continent to the other in order to kill their fellow beings, is because in some sense they want to do so. They do so because they're defending the things that they love. The problem that Tolstoy identifies in this thesis is that the things that men love and which cause them to fight are not necessarily of their own choosing. In other words, I mean, to some extent, we can be forced to fight because we can be conscripted, we can be flogged if we don't fight, We can be forced by the systems of power which are entrenched in politics to fight. But equally, the cultures that we live in also cause us to understand what we love in challenging and contentious ways. So, for example, we can, without force, choose to fight for love of country, for our nation, for our czars, for our kings, for our honor, or indeed to protect our families. And what Tolstoy wants to say, I think, or at least the way that we interpret Tolstoy, is that the reasons for fighting can be more or less noble. So to fight to defend one's family is more noble than fighting to defend one's czar. But we do not make a conscious decision about what it is we're going to be fighting for. And this is the problem of politics. There's no way that we can assess, if you like, independently the motives or the incentives that cause us to fight. So in the end, Tolstoy argues that politics, however it's organized, whatever kind of cultures it fosters, we're always going to have this problem of war and conflict because it is the heart of our social relationships. And the only way that we can escape war is actually to think or to move from politics into a different way or a different perspective, and that's to religion, and to understand that our primary relationships are not to each other, but actually to God. The tragedy, I think, of Tolstoy's writing is that while he thinks it's possible for some people to withdraw from politics and withdraw from their social attachments, he doesn't think it's actually possible for most people to do that, at least in War and Peace, until they reach the point of death. Okay, over to you, Alex.
So Proudhon has a slightly different take on this, and what he argues ultimately is that we can move from statism to anarchy and think about anarchy as a mature form of civic constitutionalism, and he does it slightly differently. So for Proudhon, what we're seeing what he was seeing in the middle of the 19th century was the emerging complex division of labor. And so the groups I was talking about earlier, and the groupification of peoples and of groups and of their relations to one another, were becoming complicated by the invention of technology, of industry, and so on. And these were causing societies to be much more integrated, but much more complex and diverse, and involved, of course, huge macro social processes. But if these were going to enable individual flourishing, they had to be for the groups, not monopolized with those surpluses. For example, surplus power, surplus value is a concept Proudhon invented, without having those surpluses extracted or alienated from people. And this material extraction, of course, has its intellectual or political corollary in alienation of a political autonomy to the state. So the epitome of this extraction, of this monopolization, is total war, where the state integrates all social processes in order to drive forward the interests of one group, which is, at least nominally in the 1930s and 40s, the nation, and use that integration as a means of social control, but also as an expression of social power, or what, of course, Nietzsche and Rocker called the will to power, when this concept became central to international relations theory in the 1940s and 50s. But essentially what Proudhon's saying is that, in order to get a better balance, is what we need is to think about the emergence of law as the same as what we see in international relations. So the ways in which states have come to balance their relations to one another, and in particular he's looking at 1815, and we'll come back to the Congress of Vienna in a little bit. But what he's saying is that the laws between peoples are the same as laws between sovereigns, and that all law should probably be understood at base as a form of treaty law. There isn't ever a final point of authority, because the people can always rise up and of course destroy the constitution. So what we need to understand and recognize is the social power that underpins the constitution, and understand then the relations between those groups in terms of pacts. And the normative claim then is to divide everything, leave nothing undivided, and then federate. essentially the principle of federation, as he argues in 1863, is a pact between peoples, but it's also a pact which can regulate exchange, production, markets, and everything else in modern society. And he thinks and he believes that if we can contract in egalitarian ways, we may not be able to transcend inequality, but we can certainly mitigate it. And that is what the pact is supposed to do. And this, he argues, is a mature civic anarchy. The alternative is an immature statism, which tries to essentially reduce all contracts to the social contract and then dictate the terms of exchange, production, and so on from either the center or from the capitalist, the feudal capitalism that he's seeing at that time. Over to you for Kropotkin.
Okay, over to me again. So the final person we look at in the chapter to give us another perspective on war and anarchism is Kropotkin, and at the center of the argument is the theory of mutual aid, and we interpret the theory of mutual aid as an expression of the spirit of revolt and as a sort of a way in which individuals resist domination for the sake of the well-being of their groups. So it arises naturally through cooperation, mutual aid, as does the spirit of revolt, but it's distorted by the thesis of competition that Kropotkin associates with liberalism in particular, but generally speaking with capitalism, I guess, as well. So the way we unpack the argument is to look at the critique that Kropotkin gives us in Ethics, which is the posthumously published book, his last book. The critique he presents there of Herbert Spencer's writing and Herbert Spencer's sort of civilization thesis. So Herbert Spencer is a social Darwinist. He's the guy who coins the term the survival of the struggle for existence as the survival of the fittest. And he has a theory, or his thesis of social evolution is that Western societies have emerged from a sort of a dark age of primitive barbarism into what he calls industrial liberalism, which is characterized by free trade and peace. And so the transition, or the movement towards liberalism, is a movement through which we become decreasingly warlike. That's Spencer's argument. Kropotkin calls this utterly fantastic and says it's a complete misreading of social evolution, in the sense that what has happened in the process of industrialization and the emergence of capitalism, the rise of capitalism, is that we see the intensification of conflict, the intensification of militarism, the introduction of technology and warfare, and continual threat of war through the competition between states for supremacy, particularly in Europe. So Spencer is not only completely wrong about what he calls industrial liberalism, but he's also wrong about what he dubs as the warrior spirit. So Spencer's argument is that we lose the warrior spirit as we evolve in capitalist societies. Kropotkin's argument is that the warrior spirit is actually entrenched in us, that we have just as we have an inclination to cooperate, so also we have an inclination to defend our collective well-being, defend the species, if you like. So what Kropotkin wants to do in terms of constitutionalizing is to suggest that, as Proudhon has already argued, there has to be a transformation of material condition. He nudges anarchism, however, away from Proudhon's mutualism and towards anarchist communism in order to provide a more, what he sees as a more certain or secure base for egalitarian relations, non-dominating relationships. But in the process, he also wants to say that if we can transform our economic relations and we can transform our political relations so that we are more inclined to cooperate with each other rather than compete for scarce resource, we don't lose the warrior spirit. Actually, what happens is that in the future, or at in any period of time where we constitutionalize as anarchists, what will happen is that we'll recover that sense of fighting against domination, but we'll transform the sort of the spirit of resistance which leads us to struggle violently against domination in the state. We'll transform that into a transgressive sort of force, if you like, which will identify and resist forms of domination that will stultify and entrench domination even in our egalitarian relationships. So in a sense, what Kropotkin is saying is that the warrior spirit is something like Bergson's vital force. And it's the thing that through mutual aid, it's the force through which in mutual aid, we resist the cementation of norms that become dominating even without our noticing it. Okay, Alex.
All right. So just as a little footnote, only because Ruth mentioned Bergson and that wasn't in our original script, it's worth, if anyone's interested in phenomenology and Bergson, the latest edition of Proudhon's War and Peace, published in France a few years ago, has an introduction by a guy called Alain Pinheiro, who is essentially locating Proudhon and Bergson within this long tradition of thinking about phenomenology from this sort of Proudhonist point of view, or rather locating modern French phenomenology within a longer tradition that was pioneered by Proudhon and before him others too. But anyway, winding forwards, what I want to do in this slide is tell you what this looks like in terms of practical policy suggestions. And I'm taking this from Colin Ward's piece, The Anarchist Sociology of Federalism, in case you're interested. But I'm going to sort of elaborate a little on Ward's argument. So essentially what Proudhon argued in 1861 was either, or 1863 actually, it was in the Principle of Federation, he said either the 20th century opens the era of federations or we'll be facing another purgatory of 1,000 years. And he made this argument on the basis of what he saw, as I said, the sort of monopolization of state control, what he called governmentalism, militarism, and the consolidation of the nation state, which he thought was an absolute travesty. And he thought that a solution could be found in the recovery or the reaffirmation of the 1815 Holy Alliance. Of course, this went against pretty much everything that was being said in the Republican movement at that time, of course, because the Holy Alliance was the symbol of imperial power. But what Proudhon argued was that this was the first secular balance of power in European history. And if we're going to recover some form of secular conception of order, what the Holy Alliance agreed between them when faced by Napoleon's Republican armies was an appreciation of the reality of social power for the first time. And he said that this is the tradition we need to go for, not a new fantasy of nationalism. Nobody listened. In fact, they thought he was insane. But something similar emerges in 1918 after the First World War. So as Ruth mentioned, Kropotkin was part of a group who made really contentious remarks in favor of the Entente against the Axis powers. And what Kropotkin argued was that anarchists ought to support the British and the French against the Prussians, because that was the only way that we could, for the British and the French to win, would guarantee, or at least would be a better indication of the emergence of more liberal forms of governance, and that what we were seeing in the emergence of the Prussian states was the antithesis of freedom. And of course, this caused huge consternation, and it was considered to be a sort of a rejection of his anarchist federalism, but it was deeply realistic. And I think that by 1945, of course, people had learnt their lessons. And Rudolf Rocker, at the end of Anarcho-Syndicalism, is quite despondent about the future. And of course, he's seen the decimation in the anarchist movement by this point, not only in Spain, but across the world. And what he's worried about is the reassertion of the state in the context of this new decolonization movement. Just as the reassertion of the state in the context of collapsing empires in 1918 had worried Kropotkin. But what Rocker advocates that Kropotkin doesn't is this notion of European federalism. And like Proudhon and Bakunin before him, argues for something like a United States of Europe. But this is a United States of Europe that's very unlike what, of course, was on the table in those days. This is a United States of Europe that is predicated on Republican principles of the balance and division of power, broadly federalist along a sort of Swiss cantonal model. This never went anything. Never went anywhere. The European anarchist movement became less and less concerned with international affairs. But interestingly, in the chapter sort of ends with this account of two anarchists, one Colin Ward, whose work I'm talking about in broad terms here, and another, a Welsh nationalist called Johan Bowen Rhys, who we recover to try and make a case, an anarchist case, based broadly on the ideas of Proudhon, Kropotkin and Bakunin, for a Europe of regions. And both Ward and Johan Bowen Rhys are looking at the Maastricht Treaty and what it promised, in particular subsidiarity and regionalism and the defense of minority languages, and took those principles and said, how far can we push these from an anarchist point of view? Johan Bowen Rhys was trying to do this in a Welsh context, Ward in relation to a politics that anarchists could support. Interestingly, Johan Bowen Rhys is the father of Griff Rhys, the lead singer of the Super Furry Animals, in case you're looking for interesting little side tidbits. But what all of these writers are trying to argue is that anarchy is the solution to world politics. Essentially, this sort of normative principle of federalism, an account of politics that presupposes division, a balancing of powers, the decolonization, the division and the devolution of power within the nation state and across Europe, and its reorganization in really quite radical ways. Perhaps prefigured in the Maastricht Treaty, but certainly pushed much further by the anarchists during this period and in the early 90s. Okay, so we're going to start concluding. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks. So I'm going to skip through. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to skip through this quite quickly. But as Alex mentioned, the book is broadly speaking sort of divided into two main parts. The first part is the theorization of anarchist constitutionalizing, the historical reconstruction of the theory, and the second part looks at anarchist practice. And we worked with three groups, or we worked with two groups and analysed the second. So the groups we worked with were the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and Radical Roots, which is a UK-wide workers and housing co-op. And we looked at the minutes of the General Assembly of three Occupy camps, so Wall Street, London, St Paul's, and Oakland. And what we do in each of the three last chapters is look at the constitutionalizing practice of each of these groups. So we start off with the IWW, we then look at Occupy and we focus on Occupy Oakland, and then we end with Radical Roots to look at the different ways in which they attempt to constitutionalize anarchistically. Now, the claim here is not that all of these groups are explicitly anarchist. The claim is that they're constitutionalizing themselves in ways which have affinities or which align with anarchist constitutional practice. And I mean, broadly speaking, we present a sort of a sympathetic, hopefully a sympathetic critique of the IWW, which has attempted to reconstitutionalize in the 2010s, as from moving from an American-centric union to a genuinely global one. And we look at the constitutional reforms that were introduced in the UK region. The second one is, as I say, Occupy Oakland, and that's also a sympathetic critique. And what we're trying to say in these chapters is that in many ways they sort of pull towards anarchist practices, but they don't quite deliver on them. So in the IWW, on the one hand, they're kind of stuck between or they're I don't know if the word is stuck really, but there's a tension, I guess, in their constitutional practice. So the IWW are trying to resist reform and compromise with the existing capitalist economy, and what they're trying to do is to transform that economy through industrial unionism. But what we find is that they don't actually have a very well developed idea of what industrial unionism would look like. So they rely on a concept of class struggle actually to try and galvanize workers to improve their rights within the framework of capitalist society. So that's the tension within the IWW. In Occupy Oakland, there's a different sort of tension. So on the one hand, Oakland are trying to use, like other Occupy camps, they're trying to use the concept of real democracy to push against majoritarianism, to push against elitism, and sort of the homogenizing forces of liberal democracy. But on the other hand, when they're faced with the diversity within their own encampments and the conflicts within their own encampments, what happens in Occupy, certainly in Occupy Oakland, is that they institute, or they call on real democracy to impose a unity which is divisive and ultimately splits the camp. The argument of radical roots is, again, there's a tension in what radical roots are trying to do. So they're pulling against the law, and they're pulling against property law in particular. So they attack the principle of private property, and they attempt to constitutionalize mutual aid in order to decommodify property. But in doing so, as a cooperative movement that functions within the system, they're reliant on law in order to protect principles of mutual aid that are antithetical to the concepts of authority and sovereignty on which law is predicated. So in Radical Roots' case, we're also very sympathetic to what they're doing, but what we're suggesting in Radical Roots compared to Occupy and the IWW is that they're actually, although they exist in the same kinds of tensions, they're actually much more successful in their anarchist constitutional practice than either Occupy Oakland or the IWW proved to be. Okay.
Great, thanks. Sorry, I'm having to reposition my computer because I've got the sun is just beaming through here, and I'm going bright red because it's getting so hot, and I'm trying to avoid being blinded by the sun. But anyway, sorry, to conclude. So, well, the book, the key argument of the book is that, like in international relations theory, we argue, and the anarchists have argued for over a century and a half, that anarchy is a species of order, not its opposite. Now, if we see anarchy as a type of order without a final point of fixed authority, then that actually opens up a range, in fact, an infinite plurality of possibilities, as David Graeber might have put it. It's not the antithesis of, or the impossibility of law and politics, it's actually its precondition. So this is, we're trying to recover anarchy as a condition of politics, not as something to move beyond. So we're doing this as a normative and as an analytical argument, but we're actually making much stronger claims about how anarchy is an ontological feature of society. So anarchy is built into society precisely because of the ways in which individuals and groups come together, and the way in which, by necessity, we have to negotiate our relations with one another. And there is no obvious hierarchy of groups or individuals. And as a consequence, we're obliged to find ways to mediate our social relations. And the anarchists claim that the ways we do this that are most congruent with principles of equality or of the respect of individual human dignity are to do that backed up or in line with a principle of anarchy, that is anti-statism and anti-capitalism in particular, in the 19th and 21st centuries. So anarchist constitutionalizing, then, the case studies that Ruth identified, but also the ones that we were talking about in the chapter on federalism, you know, this is a praxis, this is an actually lived praxis of putting anarchy front and center of your constitutional practice. We see it from the ways in which the Jura Federation of Anarchists articulated a particular account of anarchist federalism or anarcho-syndicalism based on the Swiss model from the 1860s onwards, and we see it routinely coming up across the actually lived anarchist movement. So the vast majority of anarchists in history have been members of anarchist unions or anarcho-syndicalist federations. And if we're going to try and understand the lived practice of anarchists over the last 150 years and try and understand what that practice can offer for contemporary constitutional political theory, the lived practice of writing and rewriting constitutions that have been at the heart of anarchist praxis for 150 years should come back to the foreground. And I think we're going to stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you. That was terrific. So we have until 7:30 for question and answer, contributions, queries, anything you like. It would be great if you could switch on your cameras and we can have a sort of make it feel like a proper seminar rather than just looking at black screens. But I do want to, before we do that, I just want to, I've been reminded something I didn't do, and that's to say a little bit about the centre, a membership of the centre. So just an obvious thing, we're very small, we don't have much money, but we do have expenses. So there's a Zoom site to pay for, Eventbrite, and our webpage. So we do invite people to make a voluntary contribution when they sign up. I mean, obviously tickets for the seminars are free, but people are invited to make a contribution. And also we do actually have a membership system. So it is possible to support the centre by becoming a member. So it's £25 a year for a full membership if you're waged. The concessionary rate is £10 per year, and that's available for students, retirees, as I'm about to be, unwaged people, and those outside Europe and North America, assuming hopefully that they will be able to afford it. There's a link in the chat relating to membership, so you can click on that if you're interested in pursuing that. So, okay, right, that's the hard sell. Tony, the advertising man. Right, let's open up for the chat and the conversation. And Andreas, did I see your hand up there, or were you about? Is that what you were about to talk about, the membership?
I was going to mention the membership. So
right, okay.
Thanks for doing that, Tony, so effectively. But I've also got a question. So thanks a lot for the very powerful presentation, Ruth and Alex. I'm just wondering, because you focus so much on constitutionalizing, it's almost as if the whole discussion is about the politics of anarchy, but there's very little discussion, at least in your presentation, about the economy or the social relations of production. Was that not important for those anarchist thinkers? And if not, why? Or in what way would perhaps the way of how the economy is organized be important for actually accomplishing those constitutional ambitions? Thank you.
You're muted, Ruth.
Do you want to start? Or
Sure. Okay. I mean, obviously, it's a very brief presentation, and we were trying to talk about federalism, but the first chapter is essentially a political economy critique of constitutional politics, which echoes very much the literature on new constitutionalisms that we hear today. I say echo, it anticipates, it echoes from history. The anarchists were very much attuned to the ways in which capitalism, private property, and so on were structuring social relations, and it was on the back of that critique of private property that the turn to politics and constitutions seemed the most logical way to go. I think what we find in the Marxist-Leninist traditions that emerged later is that political legal approach was so aligned or identified with figures like Proudhon and the anarchist movement that there was a complete rejection of it. And unfortunately, the baby got chucked out with the bathwater. So what we're trying to say is that the anarchists actually had the language, the vocabulary, the critique that we find in much of the Marxist-Leninist tradition and others that emerged later, but articulated it in a very particular context. And for that reason, of course, you can tell all sorts of stories about interrelations of Marxism and anarchism from then on. But it is there in the book. It's just not foregrounded in that presentation because we wanted to talk about war and violence and justice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Do you
can I
wanna
just
add
add, so the argument is, I mean, I think I said in the beginning of chapter 1, we sort of set out, you know, what is much more familiar in anarchism, which is the anti-constitutional critique, and broadly, anarchists argue that, you know, capitalism is co-constituted with the state, but it's not the only form of domination. So they think about other forms of domination alongside this, and that's why they reject sort of the package, if you like, of systems of domination. But we also, I suppose, touch on the different ways in which anarchists think about political economy in their constitutional practice, particularly when we look at the difference between or the shift from Proudhon to Kropotkin, so the shift from mutualism to anarchist communism, and why that's important in constitutional terms.
Okay,
I'm
thanks.
just going to add one more thing. Sorry, Tony, because I think
Oh, that's okay.
otherwise it's going to be the front end of the book heavy. I mean, the chapter on the IWW is essentially an account of how organized labor and disorganized labor managed to face down the emergence of capitalism in the United States and elsewhere from the 1910s onwards, if not before. And the Occupy chapter is explicitly an account of how the post crash economy of the United States, in fact, the world, and the emergence of austerity caused and constituted Occupy movement to emerge. And so what we're trying to account for is the ways in which the constitutions that were developed were both a product of their place and time, but also a harking back and an affiliation with a sort of should we say, more trans-historical anarchist principle of anarchy. So that's why we see this continuity between anarchist forms of constitutional politics, even in quite distinct historical periods, whether that's the 1910s, the 2010s, or whenever it happens to be. So capitalism and the transformation of capitalism is a fundamental part of the story that we tell in the book.
And it's picked up in Radical Roots.
No, it's picked up in Radical Roots too.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that, Andreas. So I have Virginia and then Ian. Virginia.
Hi, thanks. I don't know whether this is too off topic, but it's in relation to, the question is in relation to the IWW and the Knights of Labor. I was too young to appreciate when an uncle of mine died that he had been in prison with Joe Hill. I just wondered whether the chapter on the IWW, or whether you can recommend anything, or whether you're interested really in talking about the relationship to principles of anarchism, the Knights of Labor, in relation to the IWW.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. So we don't go into the relationship in detail between the IWW and the Knights of Labor, only really to say that I mean, the first part of the chapter tries to look at the sort of the historical legacy, if you like, of the IWW for a constitutional reform that started around 2014 or 15, and we're interested in setting up the kind of the conceptual and the theoretical underpinnings of the IWW from 1905. And so one of the things you find there is that the IWW, or some of the key figures involved in setting up the IWW in 1905, were very keen to distinguish themselves, to demarcate themselves, to put some distance between the IWW and the Knights of Labor. But we don't go into the reasons for that. I mean, the only other thing I'd say is that because some of the people who were involved in the IWW, including Lucy Parsons, who was an anarchist activist and whose roots had gone right back to Chicago in the 1880s. I mean, she had been a member of the Knights of Labor as well as the IWW. So there were clearly continuities and links between these organizations, even if when the IWW was set up, there was a sort of a drive, if you like, to say, well, we're not like that. We're different. We're going to be more successful. We don't have the same flaws, but we don't dwell on that analysis or attempt to assess it critically. We just put it there as a claim for the IWW's sense of distinctiveness.
In
Thank you.
terms of literature, there's an absolute dearth of it. I mean, there's just so much out there. I mean, it's dearth, is that the right word? There's an abundance of literature. The Alex Gurevich has just published a book called The Cooperative Commonwealth, looking at the emergence of the Knights of Labour. And it's a great book, and it's couched in very much the terms that we're trying to develop here. So in this sort of recovery of neo-republican constitutional theory. And he looks at the Knights of Labour as an instantiation of this drive to non-domination through cooperativism. And the writings on the IWW, I mean, given how small the IWW is and has been over the last century and a half, you'd be amazed at how much literature there is on it. It's absolutely disproportional. And but there's so much good material out there. One book that we've used quite heavily is co-edited by Kenyon Zimmer and colleagues, and it's called Wobblies of the World. And it's a really great collection of essays that sort of links both the history, the transmission of the IWW and its recent successes together. And I think it's a really phenomenal collection. I strongly recommend that one.
Thanks very much.
And thank you for your question, Virginia. So, Ian, over to you.
Yeah, is my sound working all right?
Yeah, I can hear. Well, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I've sort of stumbled through the cooperative movement in the UK for the last 30 years or so, and still trying to understand it. But the cooperative commonwealth was something that we picked up. There was an international thing with Noam Chomsky of all people, and this idea that the Americans had a cooperative commonwealth, and there was a very strong image of cooperative. It was never fully defined, but it emerged from within the sort of libertarian view part of the Labour Party and the co-op movement. And it was just, I just wondered whether you'd uncovered any of that in the work that you've been doing. So beyond Radical Roots, there's there are about 10 million cooperators that are tied up to old societies and various structures that are falling apart. But there is a rich tradition. And that was made vivid to me recently. There's a guy at the Institute Centre for Education, forgotten his name, but he turned up something called pageants, cooperative pageants held in 1938 and 1939. One was held at Wembley in 1938. One was held in 1939, in June 1939, with the Manchester and Salford Society. There were 16,000 people that were participating in the pageant, and there would probably be about 100,000 people in attendance on the cusp of World War II. So that was presenting a different vision quite powerfully, but it's not recorded anywhere until our friend at the Institute for Education kind of turned it up. And I found that really, exciting. And the Cooperative Commonwealth was sort of envisioned by a guy called Walter Crane. And his vision of the Cooperative Commonwealth was handed out as handbills during the General Strike. So the General Strike in 1926, people were being given the Cooperative Commonwealth as the sort of endpoint. And so it's a kind of vivid image. And I just wonder, I keep telling people we want to revive it, but, the other 10 million aren't listening.
Right.
Thank you.
Not so much with a comment, but anyway, what do you think of that?
So I think that's brilliant. So I mean, the short answer is no. We don't recover all of that rich history. So what we try and do in the Radical Roots chapter is situate Radical Roots, if you like, I guess in a nod to that rich history, we situate Radical Roots on the for want of a better word, the kind of the left of the contemporary cooperative movement, which nods right back to the 1840s and the pioneers. But we try and sort of show how their politics both sits within the framework of international cooperation, where you have a global movement which has 10 million members, and how it also conflicts with the shift in UK cooperative politics, which begins with a vengeance, I guess, with Tony Blair, where cooperatives are encouraged to take this role as part of the third sector and become sort of service providers, if you like, for a welfare state that can't quite meet or provide the services that it wants to do. And Radical Roots, therefore, is as I say, it doesn't quite nod or go back to sort of Walter Crane, although I'm sure that there are people within Radical Roots who would embrace that notion of cooperative commonwealth, adopt that very closely. But as I say, we're trying to sort of show how Radical Roots wants to reboot a concept of cooperation which is based on mutual aid and equality and non-domination, and do so within a framework which is somewhat unfriendly to it. So there are shades of cooperation that exist within the cooperative movement, and if we'd done that history, I guess Radical Roots would have, we could have probably made those links, but we didn't go that far back. We wanted to set Radical Roots within the politics, I guess, of Thatcherism, the 80s, and then Brown and Blair.
Okay.
Yeah, how Tony Blair killed the corpse. We cite that piece in the book. Just to sort of push a little bit further than Ruth did there. So one of the, obviously, Radical Roots identify as anarchist, or at least mutual aid is the sort of cipher for anarchism in Radical Roots. And so they've got a really antagonistic relationship to the rest of the co-op movement, and particularly the state. And one of the things that we do in the chapter, and as we explained in the presentation, it's that tension between trying to reach out to beyond the sort of the radical anarchist left of the social movement, which is Radical Roots, to more, so we say, mainstream society. That's one of the central tensions that we try and articulate in this book, because Radical Roots don't just want to be a co-op movement for anarchists. They want this to be for everyone. And one of the key messages of the book is that anarchy isn't just for anarchists, it's for everybody. And so Radical Roots really help us sort of explore some of those tensions between mainstreaming something that's quite radical, while also trying to maintain and keep that sense of identity, of cohesion, of mutual aid that has been intrinsic to enabling Radical Roots to sustain that process of the decommodification of capitalism for the last 30 years. So that's a central issue for us, but not the cooperative commonwealth as a phrase necessarily.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Ian. So now there's something in the chat. I've got my eye on the chat. So is it Evo? Can you just say it, Evo, or do you want me to read it out? You're still here. I can see that you're still here. No response from Evo. All right. Well, okay. So we'll have to just unpack this, I think.
No, Mike, I can answer the question. I understand if I'm right in terms of the system dynamics. Let's just
say what it is, Alex, and then yeah. So Eva says, I wonder why anarchy doesn't think about system dynamics. Okay, so interpret that and then answer it.
Well, I mean, I'm sure Eva can correct me if I'm wrong here, but if this has got anything to do with systems theory and the ways in which systems shape the possibilities of actors, I mean, on the one hand, the latter point I think I answered in my question in the response to Andreas, but systems are fundamental to trying to explain why, not only why anarchists are forced to do what they do, but also the systems that constrain them and the limited range of possibilities open to them at the time. So there is throughout the book an account of how systems constrain agents. That said, there's another way of thinking about systems and agents, and that is in John Walker's systems theory, the viable systems models, and of course, the wider cybernetics literature. And much of the work that we did with the IWW and with Radical Roots was informed by that broad approach to what is effectively a business management, right? So Thomas Swan, who's our postdoc during the project, was schooled in this sort of tradition of John Walker's cybernetics, and we used that approach to try and understand how organizations can be both functionally hierarchical but normatively and politically horizontal, and how those two things are not necessarily in conflict with one another, but how they generate dynamics of their own. And so, you know, that systems thinking is part and parcel of what we did, most definitely.
Thank you. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. Ivo doesn't have a mic, he says, so that explains that. But if you could respond in the chat. All right. Okay. No, thanks. So do we have any more questions? I can't see any hands up. If we don't, perhaps I'll ask something just off the top of my head. You mentioned, and have obviously written about in the book, Tolstoy, Kropotkin, and Proudhon, but you didn't in the main. I think you mentioned Bakunin once, Alex, but it didn't seem to me to figure a great deal. So I was wondering why that was. I'm not saying you should have done. I'm just curious. Or why is that? Is that does he not talk about the issues that you're interested in, or why is Bakunin excluded if he is?
Because he's a naughty boy.
Is it not? Right.
No, he's not excluded. In
Right,
fact,
okay.
we use Bakunin a lot, particularly in the first chapter, and in the second chapter actually. But I suppose when it comes, I mean, because the focus of this talk was really on war and federalism, he appears in federalism, but we don't use him in the chapter or in the first part of the chapter where we talk about war, because we wanted to be crisp, I guess, in the way in which the division was between constitutionalists and non-constitutionalists, i.e. Tolstoy versus the others. So to reinterpret the argument about pacifism, or to think about that from a different perspective. And then to highlight the shift in political economy, if you like. So to give you to give readers two different concepts or main sort of templates, I guess, for want of a better word, of anarchist constitutionalizing. So he kind of just drops out in that first bit, but he's crucial for federalism, and he's absolutely crucial for the critique of contract and for the critique of law, authority, theologism. I mean, it's all there, and yeah. So he is still a looming presence in the book, but he just doesn't feature in the bits that we're talking about today.
Okay, I suspected as much. Thank you very much. I'm time filling here in the desperately hoping somebody else. I've got a few questions, but I just don't think it's appropriate for the chair to be actually sort of dominating this discussion. So does anybody else have anything they'd like to say? Am I missing something? I think usually a little yellow hand goes up if somebody wants to. Well, I'll ask another one then. Okay. It has to do with this concept of the will to power, which I associate with Nietzsche, of course. But I think Alex associated it with Rudolf Rocker. But I think it was Ruth who you sort of drew a contrast between people who advocate the notion of the will to power on the one hand and anarchists who constitutionalize on the other. Have I understood you correctly? And it's just
sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that. So that would seem to exclude Nietzsche from the anarchist tradition, as it were. But I know that at least some people, anyway, think that Nietzsche was an anarchist, actually, and clearly, presumably, not a constitutionalizing one. So there's just an issue there about, I guess, what the particular way we talk about anarchism, and from the point of view of Nietzsche and his concept of the will to power.
Yeah. So Nietzsche doesn't feature actually much, although we do talk about him a little bit in the discussion of Kropotkin, mutual aid and war, because there are clearly resonances between Kropotkin's critique of liberalism and Nietzsche's critique of liberalism. The difficulty, and again, we don't try and assess the claim. The difficulty for us is that Kropotkin and Rocker uses the phrase will to power, and he attributes it to Nietzsche, and both Kropotkin and Rocker read Nietzsche very negatively as an advocate of aristocracy and therefore not anarchist. So all of the nuance that you might otherwise get by thinking about the overlaps between, or the relationship between Nietzsche and the anarchists and nihilism and all the rest of it, none of that features in the book. But we do, as I say, when we start thinking about the way in which Kropotkin thinks about transgression, the way in which he sets up the critique of altruism, egoism, this broader sort of sense of the problems of Spencer, he gets into the footnotes. So we try and soften the anarchists' rejection of Nietzsche, and we use rather than say that Rocker's conception of the will to power, insofar as he ties it to Nietzsche, rather than reinforce that argument, we simply take the distinction that he makes to think about the different cultural processes that he's trying to trace. So we don't want to sort of hammer Nietzsche and say he can never be an anarchist, but we haven't got space really to go into the argument. But I think it's an interesting one, a really interesting one.
Okay, right.
I'm just going to add one quick thing to that, just to reiterate what we said in the presentation. But the will to freedom is a distinctive way of approaching the same problem. And obviously the anarchists and we don't get into the distinction between the will to freedom that we find, or the will to power in Nietzsche, and the will to freedom in Rocker. But what the will to freedom does in Rocker's writings is it affirms this drive for non-domination, this drive towards cultural mutual aid in order to realize collective ends as a fundamental element of anarchist political practice. And what's interesting, I think, in that period is how that conception of will to power became so central to German immigrant thought in the United States, particularly in international relations, where the will to power was conceptualized as a national urge to drive forward nation states up to 1939, 45. And that this was part of the problem of world politics. But what the anarchists show us is actually there's something intrinsic to that will to power on a national level that is about the will to freedom. And I think this is what Morgenthau and others were talking about in the mid-40s. But the anarchists give this a very anti-statist spin, and I think it's been unjustly neglected in the history of international thought.
Okay, thank you. So now I do have two hands up. So you've saved me. So, but no, I can't see anybody. I think, is it Sayo? Forgive me, I've got a cataract and it's about to be operated on. So I need to leave. I think it's Sayo. Do you have a camera? Oh, you do. Oh, well done. Thank you.
Yes, hello. I hope this works now. Hi, thank you both. Hi, Alex. I think last time I saw you, I was called something slightly different, but that's the way it goes. I haven't really fully formed my question yet, but I was interested in the debate between, or the anarchist critique of the liberal social contract theory, this idea that the state exists because it serves everyone's interests and allows law to function. Empirically speaking, there is no evidence for that at all, and there is in fact loads of evidence on the contrary. And I don't know exactly what my question is, but I was wondering if you could both speak more to what sort of debate, what sort of challenges have anarchists brought? Is this an empirical challenge that anarchists have brought, or is it something else? And also, how come this idea, which has no grounding in reality, in actual prehistory, how come it's still so popular? I mean, is it just to do with power interests, or is there something else going on? Thanks.
I might say a couple of words on the theory, and maybe Ruth can tell a little bit more of the empirical story. I don't know, but anyway, I'll just very quickly on the theoretical arguments in the middle of the 19th century. The notion of the social contract was, particularly Rousseau's thought, was about trying to recover some sense of communal autonomy in the face of imperial power. And if we interpret it as generously as we possibly could, there's an anarchistic ethos if the aim is really to reconstitute politics under the oak tree in the communal square. What the anarchists argued is that what Rousseau had done is he'd taken that idea and he'd nationalized it, and in upscaling this notion of communal autonomy, essentially what he'd done is he built in new hierarchies, and that this was a fundamental abrogation of this sort of commitment to freedom that sort of animates all of his writings, or at least in principle. What the anarchist said, though, however, is that, not only is the social contract a bad idea in practice, but in reality, in theory, it doesn't work, because that social contract is never between individuals. Social contracts are constituted by groups vis-a-vis one another. And what the social contract tradition leaves out is the reality of these social groups, whether these are what Proudhon called later on the people, or peoples in the way that they organize, or the ways in which the modern division of labor carves people out in particular ways through specialism, but also through exchange and production. Each of these groups are real, he says, and that they need a conception of political autonomy and to be able to constitute in relation to one another. Interestingly, in the late 1940s, a French sociologist of law, a guy called George Gurevitch, wrote what he called a social constitution of rights, or rather the constitution of the social contract, which the social constitution, I can't remember exactly. But essentially what he argued was for a pluralist conception of politics where the group, as well as the individual, has rights vis-a-vis others, and that these are mutually held, they're reciprocal or commutative. They're not determined by a sovereign power. Now, there's all sorts of different ways that we can interpret that, but of course the anarchists always said that sovereign power was about determining a fixed and final point of authority and could only ever be unjust. We gave a spiel about that in the talk too. But anyway, I'll hand over to Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and so contract works, or the critique works on a number of levels. So there is an argument which contests the sort of pseudo anthropology, but I guess the reason and Bakunin, to come back to Tony's point about Bakunin, I mean, in Bakunin, contract is a hanger for him to develop a critique of theologism, or the idea that the role of government is to perfect us, and it's for our own good. But I guess one of the functions it serves in the chapter is to also think about the claim or the use that that constitutional or defenders of the Constitution, of liberal and republican constitutions, the use they make of contract theory to defend the idea of the people as the constituent power. So the apparent shift from absolutism and the democratization of the Constitution. And what the anarchists are doing is trying to expose and reject that move, in order to say that you're just shifting the locus of decision making and power, but actually you're not doing anything to unpack the concept of authority that underpins it. So this is a shift within the state. It's not a shift of the Constitution doesn't actually fundamentally change the problems of authority that are set up. So the change from Hobbes to Rousseau is significant, but not that significant.
That's great. Thank you for that question. So we've only got time really for one more question. So Virginia's asked Alex to say something or put something in the chat about the will to power and German thought in the United States. Perhaps you could do that in the chat if you would, and that will just give us time for this last question from EC. I think that is. Again, I don't know who you are. Aha, right, here we are. EC, hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ewan. I'm at University of Edinburgh. I do a lot of I'm deciding what to go for, whether theory or empirical stuff. So I was gonna talk about Gramsci. I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna ask about I just want to say, Ruth, I work with civil society in Southeast Asia, and I've been using your pamphlets about constitutional talking with colleges. Basically, I work with education, and that's sort of my background is this sort of what I would classify as a form of anarchism in Myanmar, actually. And my question, or my sort of thing that I wanted to ask about, was actually on a bit different. In terms of this constitutionalizing. So I read this book called The Making of the English Working Class, and you've probably heard of it. It's by a guy called E.P. Thompson, and it's. I mean, when I read that book, I always thought it was very anarchist in spirit, and this idea, because it denaturalizes the state, and it's talking a lot about all these sort of secret societies and sort of groups coming together, forming. And I just wondered if that. I mean, have you ever? What do you think about that? Is there any evidence within that of sort of constitutionalizing within those sorts of groups that formed around the late 1700s, early 1800s. You know, based on that sort of the milieu that Thompson was studying. I wonder if you've ever, yeah, look, whether that's sort of an interesting line of inquiry. That's basically it. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. No, it's a really interesting line of inquiry, and one that we haven't actually thought about, or we don't think about in the book. And I agree with you that Thompson is, you know, is sort of libertarian. And I mean, I know Thompson from the work he did on William Morris, and particularly the sort of the way in which he sort of recasts Marxism and utopianism through Morris's lens. But I mean, the answer to the question is we don't go that far back. So we're taking the constitutional moment as the beginning of the 19th century, I guess, the sort of, so, you know, the age of revolutions. And we're interested in the ways in which anarchists understood constitutionalizing differently. And I think that would sort of align with some of the things that Thompson, some of those lineages that he looks at and thinks about. I guess the difference would be that, I mean, the clue is in the title, right? I mean, it's the making of the English working class. So the anarchists are not just interested in the way in which classes constitute themselves, but the ways in which individuals and groups constitute themselves in multiple and conflicting sort of categories or identities, or I'm not quite sure what the labeling would be. So class is one of those dynamics, but it's not the only dynamic. And so, you know, because I mean, the principle, I think Alex mentioned it in the beginning of the talk, the principle is to divide everything. So you don't end up in a singular place. You end up in places of contestation and difference. And the Constitution is the thing that enables you to address those differences. Do you want to add, Alex?
No, I don't. I think that was a question for you, but I've also just been putting some stuff in the chat, so it's not been paying attention either.
Thank you, EC. That was an excellent question.
Can I just say, I mean, it would be great to talk offline more about it. I mean, if we can, you know, send me an email or talk again, that would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. We've run out of time, and I'm a ruthless dictator when it comes to matters temporal, so we are going to stop. Thank you very much, both of you. That was terrific, and equally stimulating question and answer session as well. So thank you to all of you for participating and asking the questions. Yes, we'll thank Ruth and Alex in the usual manner. Right, well, I think that's it. Hopefully you've all got the programme, so I'm not sure, I should have checked, shouldn't I? I'm not sure when the next seminar is, but if you don't have the seminar programme, it's on the website, or you could email me and I'll send it to you. And so we'll see you next time. Thank you again, Ruth. Bye.
Thanks, Tony. Enjoy retirement.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks to Oliver as well.
Oh, yeah. Yes, our supremo when it comes to matters technical. Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.